Emily Larson sat quietly at the back of the dimly lit bus, clutching her backpack against her chest. The hum of the engine and the occasional chatter of passengers filled the air, but Emily barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the hospital visit earlier, the conversation with the doctors, and, most of all, her father. Her left arm, ending just below the elbow due to a condition she was born with, rested on her lap. She had grown used to the stairs, but the burden of her father's frustration weighed far heavier than any curious glance from a stranger. James Larson, Emily's father, sat slumped beside her, his breath reeking faintly of alcohol despite his attempts to hide it. His once bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion and resentment. Today had been another tough session at the hospital, and the doctor's suggestion of a prosthetic had brought a mix of hope for Emily and dread for James. The cost, the effort, the endless appointments, it all seemed impossible to him. As the bus rattled along, James leaned closer to Emily, his voice sharp but hushed enough to avoid drawing attention. "You know, we can't keep doing this forever. Therapy, prosthetics, it's all just too much." His words landed heavily, and though Emily said nothing, she felt her throat tighten. A few seats away, Andrew Hayes, a tall, sharp-eyed man in his late 30s, observed the interaction silently. Clad in his crisp white Navy SEAL uniform, he was returning from a long day at the base. Something about the girl caught his attention, perhaps the way her small frame seemed to shrink further under her father's gaze, or the flicker of sadness in her eyes when she glanced out the window. Andrew had spent years in service, trained to recognize tension, fear, and distress. He couldn't help but feel a tug of concern. James's voice grew louder. "Do you even understand what all this is costing us? And for what? You still can't even tie your shoes without help." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. Emily turned her face toward the window, willing herself not to cry. Andrew sat forward slightly, his jaw tightening. He debated whether to intervene. Was it his place? His instincts told him to wait, to watch. Then James's frustration boiled over. He stood abruptly, swaying slightly, his voice cutting through the bus. "You're a burden, Emily. That's what you are. A burden I can't carry any more." Emily shrank further into her seat, and the bus fell into an uneasy silence. Andrew's hand gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing. He'd seen too much in his line of work to ignore something like this, but stepping in now could escalate things. Still, he couldn't just sit back and watch. The wheels of the bus groaned as it slowed for the next stop, and James muttered something under his breath, turning toward the aisle. Andrew's eyes locked on Emily, her face pale and drawn. He made his decision. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Emily stayed in her seat, staring at the floor of the bus, her heart pounding. She didn't need to look up to know her father was still fuming, his frustration barely contained as he stood in the aisle. The heat of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed to intensify the weight of the moment. Around them, the other passengers remained silent, their eyes fixed on their phones or out the windows, pretending they couldn't feel the tension in the air. James turned back to her, his voice low but sharp. "When we get off this bus, we're going to have a real talk about what's next. No more of this endless therapy nonsense. You hear me, Emily?" He didn't wait for a response before stumbling a few steps toward the front of the bus. Emily didn't reply, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack as she tried to steady her breathing. Andrew couldn't take his eyes off the pair. He had seen a lot in his time as a Navy SEAL, moments of bravery, fear, and despair, but there was something deeply unsettling about the scene unfolding before him. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Emily seemed to collapse inward every time her father spoke, as though she was shrinking herself to avoid being noticed. Andrew had seen that kind of silence before. He knew it well. It wasn't the quiet of someone who didn't care. It was the silence of someone who had learned the hard way that speaking up only made things worse. The bus jolted to a stop, and James staggered slightly before catching himself on a seat back. He muttered something under his breath, then glanced back at Emily. "Come on," he barked. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward the Navy SEAL for the briefest moment before she stood and followed her father toward the exit. Andrew watched them leave, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't just walk away, not after what he'd witnessed. As the bus doors hissed shut and it began to pull away, Andrew made a split-second decision. He reached up and pulled the cord, signaling for the next stop. Stepping off the bus, Andrew scanned the street. James and Emily were up ahead, walking toward a small convenience store on the corner. James's unsteady gait made it clear he wasn't done drinking for the day. Emily trailed a few steps behind him, her shoulders hunched and her head down. Andrew followed at a distance, keeping his steps casual, blending in with the sparse foot traffic. He didn't have a plan yet, just a strong, unshakable sense that he needed to be there, to do something. He'd spent his career stepping into dangerous situations, but this felt different. This felt personal. As they reached the store, James disappeared inside, leaving Emily standing awkwardly by the door. She leaned against the wall, her gaze fixed on the ground, her expression unreadable. Andrew stopped a few feet away, pretending to check his phone, but his eyes stayed on Emily. He wondered how many days like this she had endured, how long she had carried the weight of her father's anger on her small shoulders. Before he could decide whether to approach her, the store door swung open, and James emerged with a brown paper bag. He shot a glance at Emily, then at Andrew, his eyes narrowing slightly. Andrew looked away, trying to appear uninterested, but he could feel James's gaze lingering. "Let's go," James muttered to Emily, his tone harsher now. Emily straightened up and followed him as he started down the street again. Andrew hesitated for a moment, torn between his desire to help and the risk of escalating the situation. But as he watched Emily's small frame disappear around the corner, he knew he couldn't just stand by. He set off after them, his resolve hardening with each step. Emily followed her father down the cracked sidewalk, her eyes fixed on the ground. The brown paper bag in James's hand crinkled with every step, and she knew better than to ask what was inside. She could tell by the way he gripped it, tightly, protectively, that it wasn't anything meant for her. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, and Emily felt the familiar knot of unease tighten in her stomach. Every step closer to home felt heavier than the last. Andrew kept his distance, staying just far enough behind that he wouldn't draw attention, but close enough to keep them in sight. His mind churned as he watched the pair. It wasn't just Emily's quiet demeanor that struck him. It was the way she seemed to anticipate every move her father made, like she was constantly bracing for something. He'd seen that kind of tension before, in soldiers who had been in combat zones too long, their bodies always on high alert. But Emily was just a kid. She shouldn't have to live like that. As they turned a corner into a quieter residential street, James slowed his pace and looked back, his eyes scanning the sidewalk behind him. Andrew quickly ducked into the shadow of a nearby building, his heart pounding. James lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the street before he grunted and continued walking. Emily glanced back too, and for the briefest moment her eyes met Andrew's. There was a flicker of recognition, a faint spark of something, hope maybe, before she turned and followed her father again. Their house came into view at the end of the street, a modest single-story home with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. James walked up the steps, the paper bag still clutched in his hand, and fumbled with the keys. Emily hesitated at the base of the steps, glancing back one more time before following him inside. Andrew stayed where he was, watching as the door closed behind them. He felt a surge of frustration and helplessness. He wanted to act, but he knew he couldn't just walk up to the house without risking making things worse. Inside, Emily set her backpack down by the couch, careful not to make any noise. James disappeared into the kitchen, and she could hear the clink of glass bottles as he rummaged through the cabinets. She sat down, pulling her knees to her chest, and stared at the muted television. The air in the house felt heavy, filled with the unspoken tension that hung between them every day. James returned with a drink in his hand, his expression unreadable. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her and took a long sip. "You think I don't see it," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The way people look at us. The way they look at you." Emily froze, unsure how to respond. She had learned long ago that silence was safer. Outside, Andrew moved closer to the house, staying hidden in the growing shadows. He couldn't hear the exact words, but he could see James gesturing wildly through the living-room window. Emily sat still, her small frame dwarfed by the couch, her face turned away. Andrew clenched his fists, feeling the familiar frustration of knowing someone needed help but not being able to step in without making it worse. Back inside, James leaned forward, his voice growing louder. "You know how much I've given up for you, how much I've lost." His words slurred slightly, and Emily could see the familiar signs of his temper rising. "And for what? So you can sit there, pretending like you don't owe me everything?" Emily's chest tightened, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't even sure what she was apologizing for. It was the only thing she could think to say. James laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Emily. It doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't fix anything. You're just—" He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze shifting suddenly to the window. Emily turned to look, but saw nothing. Still, the interruption seemed to deflate him. He waved her off, sinking back into his chair. "Go to your room," he muttered, taking another drink. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed her backpack and hurried down the hallway, closing her door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, her heart racing, and stared at the fading light streaming through the window. She didn't know what she had seen in the window earlier, but for a moment she had felt the strange, fleeting sense that someone was out there. Outside, Andrew stepped back into the shadows, his mind racing. He couldn't leave now, not when he had seen enough to know Emily wasn't safe. But what could he do? The options ran through his head, each one more complicated than the last. He didn't have much time to decide. He had to act before it was too late. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping the faded quilt beneath her. The air in her small room was stifling, heavy with the weight of the unspoken tension that seemed to fill every corner of the house. She could hear the faint clink of glass from the living room, followed by her father's muttered words, too low to make out but sharp enough to carry their usual tone of bitterness. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could be anywhere else, somewhere far from the walls that seemed to close in on her more each day. Outside, Andrew remained in the shadows, his jaw tight and his senses on high alert. He hadn't come this far to walk away now, not when every instinct told him that Emily was in danger. He moved silently toward the side of the house, scanning the windows for any sign of movement. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. He knew he had to tread carefully. This wasn't a battlefield, and one wrong move could escalate the situation beyond control. Inside the house, James's voice grew louder. Emily could hear him pacing in the living room, the floorboards creaking under his heavy steps. She knew the rhythm of his anger well, how it built in waves, each one higher and more volatile than the last. She tried to focus on her breathing, to steady the pounding of her heart, but the sharp crash of a glass shattering against the wall made her flinch. "Emily!" James's voice thundered down the hallway, making her stomach drop. She froze, her mind racing as her hand instinctively reached for the small lock on her door. But before she could turn it, the doorknob rattled violently, and her father's voice followed, slurred but menacing. "Open this door! Now!" Her hands trembled as she stepped back, her pulse quickening. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her father's fists pounding against the door. She glanced toward the window, her mind spinning with a desperate thought. Could she climb out? Could she get away? Andrew heard the commotion from outside, his muscles tensing as he moved closer to the side of the house. The muffled shouting confirmed his worst fears. He had seen this kind of escalation before, knew the patterns too well. His hand hovered over his phone, but he hesitated, knowing that time was critical. If he called for help now, would it come too late? "Emily!" James shouted again, his voice breaking into a raw, guttural sound. The door rattled harder, and Andrew felt his decision crystallize. He couldn't stand by any longer. He moved toward the back of the house, where he had spotted a slightly open window earlier. The light inside the room was dim, but he could see enough to know it was empty. As Andrew hoisted himself through the window, careful to make as little noise as possible, he could hear the door to Emily's room creak open. His chest tightened as he landed softly on the carpeted floor of the hallway, his movements quick and deliberate. He made his way toward the source of the shouting, staying low and out of sight. Emily backed against the wall, her heart racing as her father stepped into the room. His face was flushed, his eyes wild, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you can just ignore me?" he spat, his voice thick with anger. "You think you can just sit in here and hide?" "I wasn't," Emily began, but her voice cracked, and the words died in her throat. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of his anger pressing down like a storm. She glanced toward the door, hoping for an escape, but his towering figure blocked her path. Andrew crouched just outside the room, his breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. He couldn't see inside, but he could hear everything, the fear in Emily's voice, the rising fury in her father's tone. His hand moved to his phone again, his thumb hovering over the call button, but something held him back. He needed to be ready to act now, not just wait for backup. James stepped closer to Emily, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I gave up everything for you," he said, his words slurring together. "And this is the thanks I get? Silence. Disrespect." Emily pressed herself tighter against the wall, her eyes darting around the room in a desperate search for something, anything that might help her. Her gaze fell on the window, and for a brief moment she considered running. But her father's presence loomed too large, his anger too overpowering. Andrew's breath caught as the tension in the room reached its breaking point. He could feel it in the air, the moment just before something snapped. He braced himself, his training taking over as he prepared to step in. But even as he moved closer to the doorway, a million questions raced through his mind. Would he be able to stop this in time? Would Emily be safe? And then, as if sensing the presence just beyond the door, James turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. The room fell into a tense, almost unbearable silence. Andrew's muscles tensed, his every sense honed and ready. Whatever happened next would change everything. James froze mid-step, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he scanned the hallway outside Emily's room. For a moment, the house fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the sound of Emily's unsteady breathing. Andrew remained still in the shadows just beyond the doorframe, his heart pounding as he watched James's gaze dart toward the open window at the end of the hallway. The air between them crackled with tension, and Andrew could feel the weight of every second stretching thinner and thinner. "You think I don't know someone's out there?" James growled, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. He turned back toward Emily, his movements jerky, unsteady. "Is this what you've been planning? Huh. Someone to come and take you away from me?" Emily shook her head quickly, her wide eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced toward the doorway, sensing the presence she couldn't yet see. For the first time, a flicker of hope lit up in her chest, though she didn't dare let it show. Andrew edged closer, his body tense as he prepared to step into the room. He had spent his career navigating high-stakes situations, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a family fractured by pain and anger, and the stakes felt more personal than anything he'd faced before. He tightened his grip on his phone, ready to call for help if things spiraled further out of control. James stepped closer to Emily, his looming shadow swallowing the faint light from the hallway. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, his words slurring together. "Not with them, not with anyone. You're my responsibility, and no one else gets to interfere." And then, as if on cue, a sharp knock echoed through the house, shattering the fragile stillness. James spun around, his eyes wild as he stared down the hallway toward the front door. Andrew stiffened, his mind racing. He hadn't called anyone yet, so who could it be? The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. "Stay here," James barked at Emily, pointing a trembling finger at her before stomping toward the door. The tension in the room eased just slightly as his heavy footsteps faded, but Emily remained frozen, her back pressed against the wall. Her eyes flicked toward the doorway, and for the first time she saw Andrew standing there. His finger was pressed to his lips, silently urging her to stay quiet. Down the hall, James yanked the door open, his face contorted with anger. Standing on the porch was a woman in her late 40s, her kind but determined expression cutting through James's bluster. She held a clipboard tightly in one hand, her professional demeanor unwavering even in the face of his hostility. "Mr. Larson?" she asked firmly, her eyes briefly flicking past him toward the house. "My name is Karen Parker. I'm with Child Protective Services. We received a report about concerns regarding your daughter, and I need to speak with you." James's face twisted into a sneer. "A report? From who?" he snapped, his voice rising. "There's no problem here. Whoever told you that is lying." Karen remained calm, unfazed by his outburst. "I'm just here to check in, Mr. Larson," she said, her tone steady. "This is standard procedure when we receive concerns. May I come in?" James hesitated, his grip tightening on the door frame as his mind raced. Behind him, Andrew watched from the shadows, his heart pounding. He hadn't made the call, but someone else had. The timing couldn't have been better, or more dangerous. Inside Emily's room, she stood frozen, her gaze darting between Andrew and the faint outline of her father's back in the hallway. She could hear the tension in his voice, the way it teetered on the edge of control. For the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come to help. But then James turned back toward the hallway, his eyes blazing with suspicion. "Stay right there," he snapped at Karen before storming back toward Emily's room. Andrew barely had time to retreat further into the shadows before James entered, his expression dark and dangerous. "Emily," James said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you better not say a word to anyone. Do you hear me? Not one word. Or I'll make sure you regret it." Emily nodded quickly, her body trembling under the weight of his threat. Andrew felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. This was the moment he had feared, the moment where everything could spiral out of control. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew one wrong move could make things even worse. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. From the doorway, Karen's voice interrupted the mounting tension. "Mr. Larson, I'm going to have to insist that we speak," she called out, her tone firmer now. "It's important that I talk with your daughter as well." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he turned back toward the door. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he stormed past Andrew's hiding spot, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Andrew exhaled silently, his mind racing as he prepared for what was coming next. Whatever happened, he wasn't leaving Emily to face it alone. Emily sat stiffly on the edge of her bed, the tension in the air so thick she could barely breathe. She could hear her father's angry footsteps storming down the hallway toward the front door, where the social worker was waiting. Her hands gripped the quilt tightly, and her heart pounded in her chest. Andrew remained in the shadows near her door, his eyes locked on hers. He gave her a slight, reassuring nod, silently promising he wouldn't let anything happen to her. At the front door, James flung it open wide, his anger spilling out in sharp, slurred words. "I told you there's no problem here," he yelled, his voice echoing through the small house. "This is my house, and my daughter is fine. You people just want to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Karen, standing firm on the porch, met his fury with calm determination. "Mr. Larson, we've received multiple reports of concern regarding your daughter's safety," she said evenly. "I need to see her and speak with her privately. This is not negotiable." James's face twisted into a mixture of rage and panic. "Reports," he spat. "Who's saying these things? Lies, all of it." He took a step forward, his body blocking the doorway as his voice rose. "You're not coming in here." Behind him, Emily flinched at the sound of his shouting, her body instinctively curling inward. Andrew, sensing the situation escalating, moved silently out of the shadows and knelt beside her. "Emily," he whispered softly, his voice steady, "this is your chance. If you feel safe, now's the time to step forward." She looked at him, her wide eyes brimming with uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, to believe that things could get better, but fear had a tight grip on her. 4 years, her father's anger had loomed over her like a storm cloud, always threatening to break. At the front door, Karen reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "Mr. Larson, if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to call law enforcement," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We can handle this peacefully, or we can escalate. It's your choice." James froze, his breathing heavy, his mind racing. For a moment, it seemed like he might explode, but then his shoulders slumped slightly. He stepped back, letting Karen enter the house, though his eyes burned with fury. As Karen stepped inside, she caught sight of Emily in the hallway, her small figure framed by the dim light of her bedroom. "Emily," Karen called gently, her tone soft and inviting. "Can you come here for a moment? I'd like to talk with you." Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward her father, whose glare felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. But then she felt Andrew's steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "You can do this," he said quietly. "I'm right here." Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Emily stood and stepped into the hallway. Her legs felt like they might give out beneath her, but she kept walking, her gaze fixed on Karen's kind face. When she reached the living room, Karen knelt down to her level and smiled warmly. "Hi, Emily," she said. "I'm here to make sure you're okay. Can we talk for a little bit?" James took a step forward, his fists clenched. "She doesn't need to talk to you," he snapped. "She's fine, aren't you, Emily?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Andrew stepped into the room. "Mr. Larson," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "you need to step back and let her speak. This isn't about you. It's about her." James whirled around, his face darkening with rage. "You," he snarled. "What are you doing here? This is none of your business." Andrew stood his ground, his posture firm. "It became my business when I saw the way you treat your daughter," he said. "Emily deserves to be safe, and I'm not leaving until I know she is." The tension in the room was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken words. James lunged forward, his anger boiling over, but Andrew moved swiftly, intercepting him with the practiced precision of years of training. Karen stepped between them, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Enough. Mr. Larson, you need to calm down immediately." At that moment, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they approached the house. James froze, his face a mask of fear and defiance. "You called the cops," he said, his voice trembling. Karen nodded. "For Emily's safety, yes," she said. "This ends now." The final twist came when Emily, her voice small but steady, spoke up. "I'm not fine," she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I'm scared all the time, and I don't want to live like this anymore." The room fell silent. For the first time, James seemed to truly hear her, his anger giving way to something resembling regret. But it was too late. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the windows, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the porch. Emily stood tall, her fear giving way to a newfound strength. She wasn't alone anymore. The flashing lights from the police cars painted the small living room in shades of red and blue. Emily stood in the center, her small frame steady despite the whirlwind around her. For the first time she felt a weight lift, just slightly, but enough to breathe a little easier. Karen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her calm presence anchoring Emily as the officers entered the house. James stood frozen, his defiance crumbling under the weight of what was happening. One of the officers approached him, his voice firm but professional. "Mr. Larson, we need to speak with you outside." James opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His shoulders slumped, and with a resigned nod, he followed the officer to the front porch. Karen knelt down beside Emily, her voice soft. "You did the right thing by speaking up," she said. "I know this is hard, but you're so brave for telling the truth." Emily nodded silently, her throat tight with emotion. She glanced toward the door, where Andrew stood, his watchful eyes ensuring she wasn't left alone. As James was led out of the house, he turned back, his gaze meeting Emily's. For a moment, the anger in his eyes softened, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. "I'll fix this," he said, his voice low. "I'll make it right." Emily didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she believed him, and for now she couldn't afford to. She had spent too many years waiting for promises that never came. With James gone, the house felt quieter than it had in years. Karen stayed close to Emily, asking gentle questions about her needs and what she wanted to happen next. Emily hesitated at first, unsure of what to say, but Andrew's reassuring presence gave her the courage to speak. "I don't want to go back to how things were," she said finally, her voice steady. "I want to feel safe." Karen nodded, her expression kind. "We'll make sure of that," she said. "We'll find a safe place for you, and we'll help you through this." Andrew stepped closer, his voice warm but firm. "Emily, you're not alone in this," he said. "I've already reached out to some people who can help. There are organizations that will support you with therapy, school, and anything else you need. You have a future ahead of you, one where you can be happy and free." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Andrew smiled, the weight of his own memories flickering briefly in his eyes. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," he said. "And because you deserve a chance to live the life you've dreamed of." The hours that followed were a blur of conversations with officers, social workers, and neighbors who had gathered outside, curious and concerned. Karen arranged for Emily to stay with a foster family nearby while plans for her long-term care were made. Before leaving, Emily packed a small bag with her favorite belongings, her sketchbook, a few photos, and a bracelet her mother had given her long ago. As she stepped out of the house for the last time, she paused on the porch, taking one last look at the place that had been both her home and her prison. Andrew stood beside her, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't walking away alone. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to rebuild her life. With the help of therapy and the support of a loving foster family, she started to find her voice again. Andrew kept his promise, connecting her with a charity that offered to cover the cost of her therapy and even begin discussions about a prosthetic arm. Slowly but surely, Emily began to believe in a future that didn't feel out of reach. One afternoon, as she sat in a bright, sunlit room sketching, her foster mother brought her a letter. It was from Andrew. She opened it carefully, her heart warming as she read his words of encouragement. At the bottom, he had written, "Keep going, Emily. You're stronger than you know." For the first time in years, Emily smiled, a real, unguarded smile. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She wasn't defined by her past anymore. She was free to write her own story. And this time, it would be hers.